Okay, so I'm completely ready to go. And as you can see, I'm having interrupted the work in progress we were doing on technology last week in light of the announced memorandum of understanding between Iran and the United States and the hope that that might lead in the direction of stable peace. I'll talk more about that in just a moment. I'm going to return to what we left off discussing. And so I'm going to frame the question I want to discuss with you this week in terms of the accelerating velocity of technological change. And you look at these, you may see them timelines of human history, and they'll highlight transformative technological change, the iron plow, fire, the wheel, a little bit far back for us to go, but the mechanical loom, the steam engine. And what you will notice is that for much of human history, these changes are millennial changes. They occur rarely, maybe every 1,000 years. And then beginning with modern history, with what's sometimes called the age of invention, we begin to get a pace in which transformative changes, the mechanical loom, the steam engine, electricity, telegraphy, the telephone. These are right changes that are occurring every 50 years, every decade, every few years. And of course, we get into the 20th century and we go from radio to television to digital media to the internet to personal computing and then to handheld personal computing and cellular communication and social media and artificial intelligence. The rate of, and I've listed all of those in a very offhand way. I think we sometimes lose track of how important the changes in um, industry, in productivity, in social relations, in human psychology, in communication, in presentation of the self to the other, all of these technologies have brought about. Each one of them, and the one of the founders of Google compares artificial intelligence to fire or the wheel. Others compare it to electricity. Right? These are fundamentally transformative inventions or technological transformations, and yet they occur so quickly on each other's heels that we have, I think, become inured to them. I think we live in a rate, I'm sorry, a moment of constant technological churn. And that's just become, if you will, the new normal for us. But I do think from the perspective that we've been talking about as we've entered our discussion of these topics together, from the perspective of ethics and politics, of the need on the one hand to regulate our use of this technology personally in order to use it in ways that are good for us or to avoid using it in ways that damage us. And on the other hand, figuring out as a society what kinds of regulations we want to have. Do we just want to go where this technology will take us? How quickly do we want artificial intelligence to take off? Um, these are questions that require an evaluative perspective that evolves as the technology evolves. And the idea that evaluative perspectives may not evolve as rapidly as technology evolves. And this raises then the question, can we keep up with, can we develop the normative and the political, ethical resources required for an age of rapidly accelerating technological change? If not, do we have the power, the will, the capacity to pump the brakes, to say, well, if we can't keep up ethically, and if the result is we're just being driven wherever this technology takes us, and if we're unhappy with where the technology is taking us, or even more deeply worried about perhaps existential threats, deep risks from the new affordances this technology delivers, shouldn't we slow down? We're driving fast down a road we've never been down, with apparently vertiginous cliffs on both sides. Maybe it's time either to really get good at navigating that new terrain, or else slow down our journey into it. So that's the question I'm going to focus on today. I have two images on the board, both pieces of Italian art from 1913. And I would point out, right, obviously the context is not only World War II, but also all of the new military and industrial technology that is being introduced in the first decades of the 20th century, increasingly also communications technology, electricity, and two different reactions to it. So the first is Umberto Baccioni's unique forms of continuity in space, and it's a very famous sculpture. It's the many people point to it as the birth of what's sometimes called Italian futurism, and it's meant to convey. I'm not sure how well you can see the three-dimensional sculpture in my one-dimensional presentation, but it's meant to convey dynamism, velocity, acceleration, and this is sometimes also called accelerationist art, and so the idea of hurtling into an exciting and invigorating new future. I think it's meant to be an image of motion, but also of excitement. And on the other side of the screen, I have Giorgio de Chirico's Ariadne. And if you're familiar with the myth, right, Ariadne has been abandoned by Perseus on an island. And by the way, in the very far distance on the horizon, there's Perseus sailing away, right? She's been abandoned. It's a story of desolation. It doesn't end there. There's more in Ariadne's tale that makes things a little bit happier pretty soon. But now look at where Chirico has put Ariadne, right? In not only an island with a ship, but also a steam engine steaming along, right? A factory with a big billowing smokestack, and modern, cold, neoclassical, soon to be fascist architecture, right? And she's almost the statue of Ariadne that you see in the Vatican, right? The top to a sarcophagus, right? Is she really a woman of flesh who's just been rescued from a sea monster, or is she a cold stone representation? And so I think what I get from the De Chirico is a sense that this modern world that we're entering is not bracing, is not exciting, the dynamism, as opposed to being something that we should bravely welcome, is deeply anti-human and alienating. And he succeeds in many ways in conveying this through many of his paintings. I thought the fact these were both painted in 1913 gives us a nice juxtaposition. Now, before we get into the further discussion of technology, I want to start for a minute with what I'm just going to notice in the week's news and return to. And I'll say this very quickly. We are meeting essentially a week before the 4th of July, and we'll be talking again on the 4th of July. And so I'll save my sustained reflections on the anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which many people see as the anniversary of the birth of our country, and the 250th birth for next week. But I'll say this very quickly. Correct me if you think I'm wrong. I was around in 1976 for the bicentennial. One of the things I remember is people painting their the fire. I'm sorry. I'm going to say plugs because I'm on the East Coast, but we say hydrants on the West Coast. Red, white, and blue. Right. I was so proud of my red, white, and blue shirt that I wore it to school every week. The Declaration was put on a train that was also painted red, white, and blue that went across the country so people everywhere could visit. I think there was a genuine sense of sustained national celebration that went over the course of that year. And I'm just not seeing anything similar this year. And so I just want to say briefly how I'm reading this moment. And the idea that in 1976, despite the fact, right, that we were experiencing sustained stagflation, that we had the hangover of both Watergate and the Vietnam War looming over us, I think there was genuine pride in the longue durée, the long narrative of American history, in the progress that we could say we had made in perfecting our union and bringing our politics, our constitution, our society, and our culture closer to the ideals articulated in the Declaration of Independence. And it seems to me in 2026, the shared national experience is one of accelerating and deepening decay of our institutions. And that it's really hard to celebrate the right accomplishments when they appear perhaps to be receding as opposed to being sustained, being overwhelmed or undercut by what has happened in the last 50 years. And so more on that. And by the way, I will try to be not only critical, but also celebratory next week. I do think that one of the issues we have, of course, is that we have a president who doesn't seem to be particularly attached to the ideals of 1776, or his version of them is so distorted that it's really impossible to recognize in them what I think an honest reading of the promise of the Declaration of Independence is. And so to the extent that we're going to celebrate this, we're probably not going to celebrate it nationally in a way that is led by our national government. We're going to have to celebrate it individually. That's a little bit of what I'm thinking about in terms of next week. Let me think about the week that's just passed, and I'll start with a moment of hope or progress. Congress passed major legislation last week, and there's so much going on, I think we can lose track of it. But we have a piece of legislation that won't immediately, but if enacted, if it successfully goes into effect, could potentially increase the supply of affordable housing in the United States over the next decade, might even do so dramatically. And I won't get into the details of the legislation because it's not yet actually law, but both houses of Congress passed the same bill. And it is, by the way, a work of genuine and deep bipartisanship. So it's not just that both parties voted for this legislation by large majorities, it's the ideas that came from members of both parties are incorporated into this legislation. There's something there for conservative Republicans, something there for liberal Democrats, and it's a reassuring moment when the two parties can find stuff that they can do together that appears to address what is a major crisis in American society, the affordability crisis and the absence of affordable housing, the fact that so much of our affordable housing has been bought up by real estate conglomerates, including individual houses. The fact that so much of the new construction is catered to the wealthy or the hyper wealthy and not affordable. This coincides with the report out from the federal government that says we might have uh, fallen short of our annual housing construction need in 2025 by 7 to 9 million houses built, right? That many fewer than we actually need. This would be a great moment. And by the way, both the Democrats and the Republicans want to pass this bill now because, of course, we're headed into a midterm election, and they want to be able to say to their constituents, we're doing something for you. We recognize the affordability crisis. This is not going to help right away, but please be patient with us, and you will see that we have begun to address this problem. And of course, I'm sure you followed Donald Trump then, as the stage for the signing ceremony was being constructed, refused to sign it, right? And this is his brinkmanship with Congress. He is refusing, he says, to sign any legislation until Congress passes the Save America, I'm calling it a Voting Suppression Act. This is the act that requires that you have a passport or a birth certificate in order to register to vote. I'm sorry for the analogy, but it's the best one I have. I want to say this is like treating a pimple with chemotherapy, in the sense that, right, we have a very minor, essentially cosmetic problem with voting fraud in this country. The Heritage Foundation, which is, right, generally speaking, quite friendly to this administration, says that the level of voting fraud in this country is statistically undetectable, right? 0.0 frequency of voting fraud in this country. We have no instances in really a long time of outcome determinative voting fraud. And the consequence of passing this legislation would be that millions or tens of millions of Americans who don't have the requisite ID but are nevertheless citizens and entitled to vote would be denied the opportunity to express themselves and hold their political representatives accountable via voting. And of course, that is the point. The distribution of the requisite identification is highly skewed in the Republican direction. And so this would prevent the voters from punishing an unpopular president and an unpopular party. And that's exactly what they're trying to do, right? That they have, Donald Trump has said out loud, he doesn't think the Republicans would lose another election if they passed this bill. And very often his rhetoric reveals a deeper truth. I think he means to imply that the only reason Democrats ever win is because of fraud. Again, no evidence, and that's just pure fabrication. Total, bullshit. But the idea that if this legislation is passed, it will make it much harder for Democrats to win, not because Democrats rely on fraud, but because of the distribution of the kind of identification and the inability of many of the people who would require it to be able to acquire it in time to vote in 2026. So please note one upshot of this, right, which is that the Democrats and the Republicans jointly authored a bill they both want to be able to take home to their constituents in order to say they're doing something for them as we approach midterm elections. And Donald Trump has just made it much harder for the Republicans to take credit for this legislation. And the Democrats will, of course, be happy, all too happy, right? Elizabeth Warren was interviewed and she said, please bring all the blame on for this legislation. I'll take it. The idea that this seems to represent a recognition on the part of Donald Trump that this is too little too late in light of everything else that he has done for the Republicans to be able to pull out any kind of redemption in 2026. The way in which the tariffs affected the cost of living, the brutality of the immigration clampdowns, the um, deep unpopularity of the war in Iran and what it has done to inflation will not be counteracted by this legislation. Trump believes that the only possibility he has of escaping the accountability that a Democratic majority in Congress will bring to bear for his first 2 years in office and for the mistakes, the recklessness, the corruption, and the criminality is by preventing Democrats from gaining control, which means preventing Americans from voting or having their vote accurately and proportionately counted. Second point, right? We got a number of important Supreme Court decisions this week. We are nearing the deadline. I suspect we'll get a whole bunch more on Tuesday or Thursday of the coming week. And the idea that these decisions are supposed to be complete by the 4th of July. We're waiting, for instance, for the birthright citizenship case. But the decisions we got this week were extremely consequential. They were primarily immigration decisions, which allow the president and members of his administration to unilaterally determine whether or not people qualify for temporary protective status. And that is in explicit tension with what the legislation around temporary protective status says, that there has to be a process that the administration follows in order to make a factual determination about the level of danger in the home country before depriving people of temporary protective status. And the other piece of legislation that was at stake here is whether or not people claiming asylum have to actually physically enter the United States as opposed to presenting themselves at the border in order to qualify to hear their claim heard by American judges. And again, I think the legislation is quite clear here, and the intent is quite clear here. The intent was to prevent something similar to what happened in World War II, in which a boatload of Jewish refugees turned up in an American port and were turned away, and a large number of those people died because we would not hear their plea for asylum. And again, I want to be as clear as possible about this. The court is arrogating to itself the determination of what legislation means, even in ways that deeply contradict the plain language of the text. It is limiting access to courts to enforce rights. So now the would-be asylees don't get to be heard. And it is empowering the Trump administration. I think this reveals, and we'll just have to bear this in mind as we watch next week's decisions, that the decision-making in the majority, the 6-person conservative majority of the court, is one in which partisanship overrides fidelity to the Constitution or the rule of law. And as I say this, I have in mind, of course, the decision overturning the Voting Rights Act and then the subsequent shadow docket decision validating Alabama's districting, despite the fact that a lower court had held it to be racist in intent as well as in effect. The court seems to be unrestrained, as does the president. And so I say, taken together, these developments reflect a president, a court, a party more intent on preventing Americans, sorry, there shouldn't be an apostrophe there, from using elections to control their government than on responding to us, on actually being accountable to us. If it's to their disadvantage in terms of their ability to control the federal government or enact their legislation, then they will do their best to stymie the American people's capacity to hold them to account for policies and outcomes that are deeply unpopular, or at least on which we are highly polarized. And so, again, I return now to the 4th of July. It's hard to celebrate American democracy when one of our two main parties is in control of all of our institutions and seems to want to use that control to consolidate its power, as opposed to allowing the American people to hold them to account for the way they're using that power. Final item, right? And maybe the most significant, I've saved the worst for last, the idea that both sides in the Iran-US war are firing on each other again. And so we now have two ships in Bahrain who've been hit by Iranian drones in the last roughly 24 hours. And of course, the US has carried out a surgical strike on Iran as well. And I should note, these are limited strikes. This is not a resumption of full-scale warfare. And I believe that reflects that both sides do not want the war to resume. But they're also having a hard time maintaining the fragile ceasefire. And I think that is because both sides continue to believe that they've won and to demand the victor's spoils. And for Iran, what that really means is that they have control, sovereignty, if you will, over the Strait of Hormuz, and any ship that does not ask for permission or follow the route that Iran dictates it follows threatens their claim to sovereignty. And so two ships in the last 24 hours have tried to navigate the strait without Iranian permission, and they have been shot at. And so I'll say very quickly, I think I'm detecting signs of division within the Iranian regime. I think there are people within the Iranian regime for whom $400 billion with the Memorandum of Understanding offers is a sufficient incentive to show restraint. But we've seen that the new Ayatollah Mustafa Khamenei has publicly declared that he does not like the terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, but he is nevertheless going to accept them. I believe that indicates that there are forces within the regime, probably especially within the Islamic Republican Guard Corps, that is not happy with the ceasefire and believes it had the advantage and would like to press that advantage. And so whether or not one of the two factions will gain the upper hand may determine whether or not the peace holds. And then on our side, right, on the American side, Trump's ongoing desperation to minimize the appearance of humiliating defeat, to basically have to demonstrate in practice that we are not defeated, right? And so to call the Iranians foolish for striking those ships and then to respond militarily, I will be as clear about this as I can. I think the United States is playing with fire with the global economy. It's just not clear how much longer the world can sustain the constricted supply of oil. If that supply of oil remains choked, if the result is, right, that the price of oil remains not 25% more than it was before the war, which is where it was before the recent fighting, but 50% higher, it is possible, on the one hand, that the demand for oil will be destroyed, right? You know, that the 50% that has been lost, I'm sorry, not 50%, the 20% that has been lost, the price will have to rise high enough for nobody to want that anymore. And that will mean inflation and contraction of economic activity. Or alternatively, we don't know what the level of inflation is that's likely to trigger a recession, either in this country or globally, but we don't want to find that out. And so the idea that Donald Trump's effort to appear the victor is leading him to do things that risks genuine economic disaster. He said very clearly in Versailles he does not want to be the next President Coolidge, right? He doesn't want to be responsible for, I'm sorry, I gave the wrong president, President Hoover, right? The idea that he does not want to be responsible for another recession or depression is on his mind, but he doesn't seem to be able to act in accord with what that requires of him. All right, so let me just pause for a second because I'm about to transition back to the discussion of technology, and I do want to give a moment if you're thinking about anything in the news you want to discuss to weigh in on it. Anybody want to jump in before I go back to the technology stuff? All right, right back to the slides. So, um, one of the things I've been doing with you is trying to keep track of technology in the news, and it is just a cascade of development. So let me start with the left column here, and this concerns mainly the effort to regulate technology and the ongoing on again, off again dispute between the Trump administration and Anthropic. I'll be quick about this. You remember that Trump signed an AI oversight executive order, and the terms of the order said that it was voluntary, that AI companies are being requested to submit their most recent models to the administration 30 days before they make them commercially available so that the administration can acquaint themselves with the new model, its powers, its affordances, and whether or not it presents dangers, and then have a lead time to figure out what to do about those dangers. Well, Anthropic has two new models, Mythos and Fable 5. And although it did make Mythos available to the US government before releasing it commercially and has released it only to a limited number of companies because it is really worried about it, it started to make the other one, Fable 5, more broadly commercially available. And it too is among the most powerful models I think that we've seen. And so what happened? The US government, right, told Anthropic to stop, and in particular, not to make its models available to anybody who wasn't a US citizen. And everybody knows that that's basically impossible to do because, right, this is a highly global economy. Show me a big company that doesn't have people working in it who are both American and foreign, right? And by the way, if it's on your phone, if it's on your laptop, anybody can hand that device to somebody else who isn't a citizen. The only way to comply with the order was for Anthropic to basically rescind access to the technology that it had already sold to corporations and individuals all over the world. You can read Anthropic's apologetic letter and its hope to work things out with the US government. And by the way, it did work things out with the US government. It appears that a large part of the reason that it would work things out with the US government is because the national security agencies were using Anthropic's technology. When Anthropic shut it down, the NSA lost access to it as well. And the result was that they didn't have the most powerful tools that were helping them to do their work, their spy work, their surveillance work, their cybersecurity work. And so there was some tension within the administration. But having said that, it appears we have a de facto AI policy, which is You have to give it to the administration 30 days in advance of making it publicly available. And by the way, there's no standard, right? There's no publicly articulated policy. These are the reasons we might not allow you to make it publicly available. These are the kinds of risks we're concerned about. It is a black box, and that seems to reflect the fact that the agency within the federal government in charge of this, it's called CASI, is understaffed, doesn't really have anybody up to the task of devising this policy. And by the way, that's in part because Trump and people around him have fired all of the people who might be capable of this. And so I want to be clear, we're still adrift with AI policy, and this at a moment when Anthropic is deeply worried about recursive self-improvement, about AI making itself more powerful and creating the building blocks for still more powerful, ever accelerating intelligence explosion. The stuff of science fiction is increasingly realistic, and as The Economist puts it, an AI disaster is getting ever closer. One more thing to note here, right, that the Chinese, having been perpetually roughly 6 months behind the leading companies in the United States, now seem to be more like 1 month or weeks behind. That this new Chinese AI company, ZAI, has a model that is nearly as powerful as Anthropic or OpenAI's or Google's most powerful models. And by the way, they got there without using our highly expensive and energy guzzling data centers or the most advanced chips and processors. And so their AI, in addition to being almost as good as our AI, is a lot cheaper and maybe more efficient than our AI. And I'll say this very quickly. One of the reasons that we're reluctant, at least the Trump administration is reluctant to regulate AI, this was true also of the Biden administration, is that we perceive ourselves to be in an arms race with China. And if that rationale breaks down, right, if it turns out China is rapidly catching up with us, maybe about to pass us, then maybe the idea that we have to let these companies just do whatever the hell they want to do in order to stay ahead of China will no longer hold up. And who knows, maybe the result could be a little bit more friendliness to the idea of AI regulation from the administration. And then the question would be, what happens if China passes us? Will they be as unfriendly to AI regulation as we were when we were ahead? The other thing I'll just ask you to pay attention to for a moment. We're closing in on the end of the primary season for the 2026 elections. And what we are seeing is, right, that the super PACs associated with Anthropic, OpenAI, and the crypto industry are among the biggest spenders, among the richest super PACs in this election cycle. And I've mentioned to you before Alex Borez, who lost his bid to gain, right, the nomination of the Democratic Party in the 12th District of Manhattan. And it looks like in the end, OpenAI's PAC spent maybe $10 million in a primary in which this is as safe a seat for the Democrats as possible. So it's only an intra-party affair. This is basically unheard of largesse and flexing on the part of the super PAC, and they've been very explicit about it. Alex Borez is one of the most capable technology regulators in elected office in the United States right now, and they don't want him in Congress, and they want to punish him because he wrote the most effective AI regulation legislation in the U.S. today. So let's move on from there. But I do want you to notice how quickly this news is evolving. I'm going to pick up where we left off. It's been a couple weeks. We were talking about the Pope's encyclical letter on artificial intelligence. I'm going to say very briefly that the letter focuses on what I'm going to call Catholic humanism. And so the idea that the Gospels, the New Testament, the tradition, theologically speaking, of interpreting it, is not just one denomination or one faith, that it contains a way of articulating, more generally speaking, humanistic values, and that we need to ground ourselves in humanistic values as we begin to share the world with forms of machine intelligence that appear in many respects to be right, seemingly conscious, seemingly capable of doing one of the most essential human things, communicating with language and communicating about subjects that humans care deeply about: friendship, love, emotion, joy, pain, etc. And that the Pope is asking us to remember where human values come from. They come from human experiences. They come from being embodied, from having friends, from being in love, from feeling the pain of failed love or of the death of a loved one. And that artificial intelligence has none of that. So although it has the capacity to simulate discourse about those topics, it is not, in fact, a discourse that reflects the experience that that language refers to. So that's the humanism of this, the foundation, the idea that there's also a humanistic perspective on labor, on work, the idea that it's not just materially, instrumentally beneficial, but also essential to our identities, to our feeling of belonging, of contribution, of dignity within our society. And so we have to be weighing that as we look at the potential for automation of broad swaths of the labor force. The idea that this technology is polarizing us, is locking us into echo chambers, is encouraging us to believe disinformation because it affirms our identities and the superiority of my identity to a rival identity. The 21st century version of the Tower of Babel, I think, is a very important point. Finally, the idea that we need to maintain a focus on the primacy of human love and from there move out to a policy agenda. I have, I think, quite sympathetically tried to elaborate the letter of a religious denomination to which I do not subscribe, in part because I think it is quite um, wonderful, quite important, and it's worth paying attention to, not only because the Catholics are the largest religious community in the world, but also because the content that it contains is salutary. But having said that, I also now want to say that I'm not confident that this will do much good. And it saddens me to say that, but I'll note two things. The first is Catholics listen to the Pope when they want to, but he doesn't seem to have the authority over the flock that in previous centuries popes may have had. We see this around the teachings of the church with regards to birth control, with regards to homosexuality, with regards to divorce, with regards to usury. There's an awful lot of stuff that the Catholic Church says that a lot of Catholics shrug and say, yeah, okay, I know you say that, but I've got a life to lead. And I'm worried that the same thing would be true with artificial intelligence. But in addition to that, there's a second concern, and that is, well, it's one thing to vindicate the depth of the distinctiveness of humanity, and to ask that we take that into account as we begin to share the world with intelligent machines. But it's another thing to move from that to more specific guidance on how to use this technology, or more specific criticism of the damage that the misuse of this technology potentially does to us. And I don't believe that humanism alone, especially humanism that has, right, taken shape, been articulated and defended for thousands of years, for millennia in which this kind of technology did not exist, nothing like it was even conceived, um, we may need new values. We may need new ways of extending old evaluative systems. That what the Pope has offered us is a very important reassertion of the significance of humanist values, but that's just the starting point. We need also to think about how we extend our values into an era of very rapid and fundamentally disruptive technological change. And I think that's going to require something more original, more innovative. And that doesn't mean that the old values have been superseded, but it does mean that figuring out what to do with them in light of developments that frankly were inconceivable at the time these values were articulated, defended, transmitted, um, this is a new world, and we need to think again. And so that's where I want to start the further conversation. As I mentioned to you a few weeks ago, I want to start us out with the work of Hartmut Rosa, who is a contemporary German social theorist and who is most associated with the term acceleration. And so the idea that the fundamental experience of modernity, as far as Rosa is concerned, is an experience of acceleration. It's an experience of perpetual innovation and transformation of technology, of social relations, of practices, of values, and that we need to get our heads around the pace of technological, social, cultural, political change, and the disorientation that comes from being in a world in which the new doesn't have time to settle into the routine before it is superseded by yet something else new. And so Rosa suggests that this experience is the fundamental experience of modernity, and that a social theory that takes acceleration as its primitive category is going to illuminate stuff that social theories that start with capitalism or secularization or complexity, the theories that Rosa is in dialogue with, don't actually capture because they haven't given priority to acceleration. So he starts then the detailed discussion of acceleration with a paradox, which is that we have all these technological advancements. And I think back to kind of 1950s advertising for washing machines or refrigerators. And these are devices that are promoted as time saving us time, as providing convenience, as relieving us of tedious work, and that the experience of having these devices at the ready is not one of a sudden plenitude of time, but quite the opposite, a widespread experience of time poverty, right? Of not having enough of one of life's most essential resources to cover the demands on it. That we, and so I know most of us in this room are retired, but the idea that if we're in touch with our children, our grandchildren, our peers, we see this kind of frenetic pace to modern life in which there's just this constant multiplication of demands on time, this constant juggling, and the experience of exhaustion, and also of sense that we're spread too thin and we can't do everything we're being asked to do well. We're cutting corners, leaving tasks unfinished. And boy, do I see this with my students and my colleagues all the time. I think this is one of the central experiences of modern society. Rosa asks us to look at three different dimensions of acceleration and then to notice also that they interact with each other. The first, the one that I'm focused on here, is technological acceleration. The speeding up of goal-directed processes is the way in which he defines this. And so, right, I love going back to Jefferson and Adams. Makes sense, especially given that they're two people who were involved in drafting the Declaration of Independence and their lifelong correspondence. But the idea that they, right, both lived a long time, had really interesting things to say to each other, but very often had to wait a month or longer before their missive arrived at the other's door. And now, right, I can jet off to Europe and still teach my class with you guys from, interesting places abroad, and get back here in time to teach the class in my regular setting the following week. The idea that we are communicating roughly 3,000 miles away from each other instantaneously. We take this stuff for granted, but it is something that collapses space. And when it takes us a month for our letters to get to each other, we've got a lot more time to compose those letters and to compose our thoughts. By the way, the idea that new goods go from the designer's head to the platform that translates them into something that can be 3D printed and then into something that can be mass manufactured in an incredibly short span of time now. Again, this is another aspect of acceleration. I just will call you back in your mind to the experience I think we all have of sticking your finger in a hole in a dial and dialing the number on the phone. And then the next number. And then the next number. And the tick, 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 tick of the right dial returning to its original place. We have seen deeply transformative technological innovations in our lifetimes, in a single generation. And we may have grown inured to that, as the frog in the boiling water supposedly doesn't notice the gradual heating of the water. But wow, are we in the midst of an absolute avalanche of technological innovation. Second dimension of this is the acceleration of social change as opposed to technological change, right? So the increasing rate at which institutions, practices, and knowledge becomes obsolete, right? This is Rosa's language, the decay rate of reliability. And so I think we're all old enough to remember what I'll call a worse time, and I mean that, a time in which we didn't speak openly about homosexuality, or many of us didn't, a time in which people felt the need to be closeted or to hide that. And then we can remember, right, that the gradual coming out of more and more gay people. And then I think you may remember Joe Biden as vice president saying that he felt the administration favored gay marriage, and Barack Obama having to say, I think Joe's a little bit too far over his skis. That's not our position right now. And then the Supreme Court, right, saying actually what the 14th Amendment says is that every citizen is entitled to equal protection under the law. And if we are protecting the marriage of heterosexual couples, we're bound to also protect the marriage rights of homosexual couples. And lo and behold, there weren't fireworks, right? It turns out, I believe today, 80 to 90% of Americans don't think gay marriage is problematic. And this is, I think, an advance. But the idea that we could rely at a certain point in our life on the idea that homosexuality was not something that was publicly talked about, publicly seen, publicly recognized, and all of a sudden it is. And if you don't, right, um, actually tolerate it, then you're a bigot, you're prejudiced, you're hateful. And the idea that this is um, a rate of social change, it's not just this one issue, it occurs across a whole range of issues. And so Rosa says that another example of this would be the career path. And I'll point out to you that I think we're all familiar with the idea that for long stretches of human history, the career, the profession, the line of work of the individual was familial. It was something you just inherited. And you, as a result, grew up expecting you would do this, gradually got introduced to its requirements, maybe actually were formally trained or informally trained within the family, and then over time you got to be good at it. I am lucky to have been doing what I'm doing with you today, essentially my whole working adult life. And I will tell you, I think I'm much better at it than when I started, much more comfortable. I have, through experimentation and failure, learned a little bit better what works and how to comport myself as a teacher, how to connect with my students, how to respond to their difficulties or crises, and therefore much more accomplished, comfortable, and I hope respected or appreciated for what I do. And that the idea that the average American worker who's entering the workforce today is going to have to change careers 6 or 7 times if they are going to remain employed throughout the duration of their work lives. Not only means that there's a lot of economic insecurity during those transition periods, and a lot of, frankly, vulnerability as you enter the new workplace, vulnerability to being, right, demanded on or told what to do, and excessive time requirements put on you, but also an experience of insecurity, of perhaps floundering or not succeeding, because it takes a while to get good at a new job. And lo and behold, as you're starting to get good at it, the job goes away and you got to do something else. Similarly, the family structure, right, which Rosa suggests we have had the experience of it being stable for generations, and now it's changing very rapidly. And so that skills, social norms become outdated within a single generation, and this creates a perpetual need to learn anew, perpetual insecurity, disorientation, alienation. Finally, the accelerating pace of life. And again, Rosa puts it in somewhat technical language, the compression of action episodes into shorter time frames. How much time do you have for that activity? How long can you spend on cooking? how much time do you have to respond to that email? Wait, there's an email arriving on your computer at home at 11 p.m. at night. What happened to the barrier between the intimate or leisure space of the home and the space of social productivity in the age of interconnection? They're gone. And so the sense that what I might be doing at home, spending time with my children or my partner, or just engaged in leisure activities, perhaps to recuperate and recharge for the next day, I've got less time for that, and the time is more chopped up and divided between different activities. So Rosa suggests that these are not three independent facets of acceleration. They're actually all three related to each other. Technological acceleration, social change, and the pace of life amplify and contribute to, cause in a self-amplifying loop, each other. Technological acceleration changes society faster. Faster social change makes us feel we are falling behind. That leads us to want technology that helps us to cope with a faster pace of life. Rosa gives us a metaphor to think about this. I like this metaphor. I've actually tried to do it when I was a kid. It's like walking up the down escalator. If you're not hurtling ahead, doing everything you can to keep up and manage the constant flow of activity and technology and learning that society presents at you, you're just going to fall behind. You're going to be pushed back. And the idea that this is exhausting, that this is inhumane, and by the way, that it challenges us to devise values that allow us to make sense of all of this, to cope with all of this, to guide all of this, to protect our well-being as we encounter this onslaught of change and demands on our time, and preferably to come together and regulate it in ways that make it less adverse to our well-being. That is hard to do because the acceleration is disorienting and exhausting us, not allowing us to develop the normative and political resources required to cope with it. I think I should stop there for today. I've gone just a little bit over, but we've got time, I hope, for a little bit of discussion. Curious to hear what you think. Does this cause a light bulb to come on? Yes, this is exactly what we're experiencing. Flossie, take us away. Unmute yourself, please. Nice to see you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, perfect.
I remember when you had a telephone, all you had to do was say the name of a place, like Esplanade, and then you got your message through. Now you have to memorize three parts. For example, it's 919, then it's 266, then it's 4300. And you have 10 or 20 friends, and they all have 9 figures before you can get them. You can spend your time as you're getting older an hour before you get to the person you want to talk to, because there are so many different combinations and so many places where a 0 looks like an 8 or a 1 looks like a 4. And as you grow older, you begin to see how all those little gadgets that make life easier are driving you crazy. Or if you don't have the right combination of letters for, let us say, a prescription, you can drop dead before you get the right the right medicine you need. Just try working with a pharmacy on occasion. You don't have the right 16 numbers? Well, then you find another way of getting hold of the medicine. And sometimes, well, you can just pass out from waiting. So there is something to say about making things go fast, and it turns out that you don't know how to take advantage of something that isn't fast but is slowing you up. I come to
Thank you, Flossie. You, you're putting me in mind of my grandparents who lived in Berkeley. It's part of my original connection to the community you're at. I don't know if you know that, but the phone number was one of those 848 Berkeley numbers, if you're familiar with that. But for them, it was Thornwall, right? The idea that 8-4, the way you remembered that was TH or Thornwall, right? So Thornwall 85412. I can still remember their Berkeley phone number from all those years ago. And the idea, yes, that I can remember when I moved up to Sonoma, all the phone numbers were still 5-digit phone numbers. And so yes, the technological revolution we've seen in our lifetimes has fundamentally upended all of those old, which were at the time quite new um, innovations. But yes, let me just in response to what you said, Flossie, point out there's a slow food movement. I hope you're familiar with, right, to counter fast food. The idea being that you should actually cook your own food, or if you don't cook your own food, you should eat food that wasn't made in 5 minutes on demand at a counter, but actually cooked the way food used to be cooked. Somebody spent hours making it. And there are various now other slow movements. And so slow clothes I've come across recently. We don't need new outfits every season, right? And so the idea that there is some pushback, some sense that doing things faster is not always doing things best or doing things well or doing things in ways that are compatible with the needs of the human mind, the human body, human well-being. So yes, this is exactly where we're going. I'll say this very quickly. I'm just dying to share this. I was speaking at another community about artificial intelligence earlier this week, and somebody raised their hand and she said, I she had a bigger point she was making, but she started out by saying, I'm about to turn 103 and I've just started using artificial intelligence. And I was just both charmed and a little aghast at the idea that you still have to learn new technology when you're a centenarian. All right, Anne, I see you've got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, my point is it sort of follows along. Is that you mentioned being able to go from Thornhill to the numbers, and you could, but the pace of change that's coming to us is going to change things in such a way that it's not continuous. We are not going to be able. We do not know literally what's coming and what our life is going to be like, and it will. It is happening. I mean, this isn't something we can stave off, even if we try to put some restrictions on AI. It's already teaching itself stuff. I'm not necessarily making it dangerous, but just it will. I worry about my grandkids, even my kids who are in their 60s, because it's not going to affect me, but it is going to affect them. It's coming that fast.
Yeah.
And we do not know what it's going to look like.
And so I've tried to use the term disorienting, right? That in order to be able to navigate your social world, your culture, your place in it, you have to know your way around it. You have to know what's expected of you. You have to know the lay of the land. I'm obviously using the language a little metaphorically, but the idea that you need sufficient familiarity and that it takes time to gain that, right? We've probably, many of us, had the experience of moving into a new neighborhood and then getting lost, right? And you got to figure out the streets, the intersections, the directions, how to get from A to B when you move to a new place. And then, you know, I guess the metaphor here is, think about waking up each morning and you open the door and you find you're in a new neighborhood, right? Because,
I think it's going to be more like that.
yeah,
It isn't, I don't think we can find the metaphors because we just cannot imagine what's going to happen.
well,
And it's good, it's troubling. I mean, it's sort of fascinating to try to think about something that we are not capable of thinking about.
and so I do think, Anne, that one of the things that I'm seeing and reading about is then also retreating from the world. If the world is moving so fast, it's disorienting. You can't keep,
Mm-hmm.
you end up saying to yourself, well, I don't want to have that experience.
Yeah.
It makes me feel dizzy, lost, incapable of managing my own life, and so you end up gaming, right? I mean, and I just think it's worthwhile noting how much time younger people spend in worlds that are constructed on their computers where they toggle back and forth and do all kinds of interesting things, in part because it feels like a navigable world in which you can actually accomplish things. And
Mm-hmm.
similarly, I'm sorry, withdrawing into pornography. So I don't know if you're seeing this stuff, but the rate of sex among young people is going down dramatically. I don't have the exact figures ready to hand, but I would have thought if there's like a constant in human life, it's that young people want to have sex. And it turns out again that people are withdrawing from this and satisfying their needs in other ways because the world just seems too complicated, too fast moving, too hard to manage. And so, uh, uh, another way to put this, disorienting, yes, also disempowering. And
Mm-hmm.
being disempowered is frustrating for many people and leads them to want to find ways of re-empowering themselves. Some of that may be flight from reality into virtual worlds that are made to make you feel powerful. Some of it may be fantasies of political empowerment. I think a large part of the appeal of Donald Trump is he does make some people feel that there's a powerful gladiator fighting on their behalf. But yes, I do think you're absolutely right, Ann, that it's just going to keep accelerating unless or until we figure out how we can reassert control over the process of technological change. And yes, if I were a betting man, I don't think I would necessarily bet on us figuring that out.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, Ann. Thank you for the good, interesting comment. Anybody else before we call it a day? Thank you all. Oh, I'm sorry, Wilma, go ahead, please. There you go.
I'm I'm thinking about what my grandchildren are doing. And they're doing very fundamental things because we as human beings still need fundamental things. If you want to eat a fish, someone has to catch it. And they're involved at that level. Not everybody is off in this crazy world of whatever. I can't even put a name to it. I'm frequently very happy to be an old woman and can sit back very comfortably in my aggregate housing and watch the world go by. I don't need to be part of it. I don't want to be part of it in that way. And thank goodness my grandchildren are finding ways because you still need to have a building built And you still need to have these very fundamental things taken care of. And fortunately, there are still people doing that today.
So I'm going to share a story with you. I think it's a funny one. I have a colleague who's a young, relatively young woman. I think she might be 30. She's a physicist, theoretical physics, and I was talking with her about this topic a few weeks ago. And so we sat down and started talking about AI and new technology. And I was especially interested in the moment at the way in which the technology is engineered to be addictive and how hard it is, right, to not use it, not only because it's kind of socially obligatory, it's just hard to navigate life without it, but also because you feel kind of compelled and pulled into it. And she started by telling me about her boyfriend's best friend. And this is a young man who really appreciates her boyfriend's advice and perspective, but her boyfriend is busy, and so he can't always tease out his views. And so he's constructed an artificial intelligence version of her boyfriend by uploading all of their emails and text correspondence to a chatbot and then asking the chatbot to play the role. I think the boyfriend's name is Ori, right? Be Ori for me. Tell me what Ori would say if I bounced this idea off of him. And so that was the first thing in terms of how strange this world is. But then she said, and by the way, part of the reason Ori doesn't respond all the time, and part of the reason I don't have my phone with me right now is because we're learning to protect ourselves from this technology. And we don't want to be addicted, and we don't want to be accountable all the time or to have no intimacy whatsoever, because at any moment an email or a text message could ping into our romantic dinner. And so I was thinking about this as I was thinking about my son and my daughter, both of whom are 20 somethings and on their way starting their careers, and how they manage their use of technology. And I think they're much more careful and proactive and thoughtful than many of the people my age are. And I think it's in part because they feel how addictive it is and how bad it is for their well-being when they let themselves be pulled into it. So yes, I do think maybe, and this is where I want to go with you, how can we develop the ethical resources to live in a world of constant technological change? And abstinence, right, is one thing. Just turn it off, put it in a drawer, forget you have it, go out in the world without it, right? And it's kind of hard to do, but that's one approach. But I think probably that's an approach that has its limits. And so the idea of also figuring out ethical guidelines for using it and demanding that it be developed and used by the producers of it in ethical ways. It shouldn't have to be such a battle in which we recognize it's like, having drug dealers on every corner tempting us with something that we're addicted to. Much better to have the product engineered in a way so that we can take advantage of its utility, but not be worried about it hijacking our reward center and making us feel its pull all the time. So that is where I'm trying to go as we go further with this topic. I do think I've got to go. You guys probably got to go to lunch as well. It is good having this discussion with you guys. I mean it. I find your questions really provocative, interesting, helpful. I hope this is interesting. We'll talk again on the 4th of July. Be well, everyone. Have a good week. Try to reflect a little bit about what the 250th for the country means for you. Take care. See everybody.
Thanks, David.
Thank you,
Bye.
David.
Be well. My pleasure.
Thank you, David.
Of course. Bye, guys.